السيدات والسادة، حضورنا الكريم، أهلا بكم جميعا. نرحب بكم جميعا في النسخة الخامسة لمتحف نوبل الذي يقام تحت شعار جائزة نوبل في الأدب عوالم مشتركة. هذا الحدث المعرفي الأبرز على مستوى المنطقة والذي يسلط الضوء على إسهامات وتجارب المبدعين والمفكرين في مجالات الأدب المختلفة، فأهلا بكم. والآن اسمحوا لي أن أدعو دكتور جوستاف مؤرخ لجائزة نوبل، فليتفضل مشكورا.
So, I'm really happy to be here on this opening of this exhibition about the Nobel Prize in Literature, and I'm really happy to be here talking to you about the Nobel Prize for Literature. And, well, my name is Gustav Kjellstrand. I'm a researcher and a lecturer from the Nobel Museum in Stockholm. I've been working and doing some research on the history of the Nobel Prize for some years, and what I want to do today is to talk a little bit about the overview of what the Nobel Prize for Literature is. When you go downstairs later, I guess, and you will see the exhibition, you will see that we sort of deep dive into some works, some books that have received the Nobel Prize. But I'm here to give you the broader overview of what the prize is about. And this means I will talk about how the prize started, how the prize works, how the laureates are selected, and also some of the themes that we can see among the different laureates over time. But let's start from the beginning. What is the Nobel Prize for Literature? Well, of course, it's an annual literary award, and it's part of the Nobel Prize family, which consists of 6 prizes. Prizes for physics, chemistry, medicine, peace, economic sciences, and then, of course, literature. And let's see if this works. Yes, these prizes were started by the inventor Alfred Nobel in his will. So this is his will, his last testament that he wrote about 1 year before he died. And in this will, Alfred Nobel said that everything that he owned should be sold and then turned into a fund, and the interest from this fund should be given out as prizes in these different categories. And as you can see from the different topics, disciplines of the prize, physics, chemistry, and medicine, he was a person who was very much interested in science. He made his money as an inventor. He invented dynamite. But as you can see from this, actually, probably quite correct picture of Alfred Nobel, he was also a very literary person. He was a person who liked to read. He was always looking like that with a book in his hand. He read philosophy, history, literature, of course, poetry. He actually wrote poetry himself with, maybe we could say, mixed results. But he was at least very interested, so that's probably the reason why he started this prize. And in this will, he also described who should give out the prizes. And this job he gave to an institution called the Swedish Academy of Literature. This is an academy consisting of 18 people in Sweden, people working with language in different ways, writers or other kinds of people. And they are working in this beautiful building in Stockholm. They're actually on the 2nd floor of this building. On the 1st floor of this building is where I work. It's the Nobel Prize Museum in Stockholm. So we are neighbors with the Swedish Academy of Literature. And so they're sitting up there, there are 18 of them, and they have the very hard work of selecting the Nobel Prize laureates in literature. And it's a job they take quite seriously, and it's before you are selected as a Nobel Prize laureate, I'm sure that all of you will, but before you do, there's a very long process to go through. And for the committee, the Nobel Prize committee, it looks something like this. Let's see if this, it's a bit small, but maybe I'll walk you through it. This is the Nobel year. In September, the Nobel Prize institution, the Swedish Academy, send out invitation to people all over the world to nominate for the prize. So it's not the case that these people in Stockholm are sort of just trying to know all about literature all over the world. No, they take help. They have an international network of people who they ask for help. And these are literary scholars, they are previous Nobel laureates, of course, and also literary academies all over the world. So they get all these suggestions in by the 31st of January. So on the 1st of February, which was last Friday, the Nobel Committee meet and they start going through the list of nominees for the prize. This is a quite long list. About 200 people are nominated for the Literature Prize every year. Well, it's a long list in the sense that there's hard to decide between 200 candidates for a prize. But it's a fairly short list when you consider how many writers there are in the world. But from February till around April, they make this list even shorter. They make a short list. The first short list is called the long short list. It consists of about 20 names. These 20 names, this is a list that many people would like to see, but unfortunately for us, it's top secret. But this is a list of the 20 writers that the Swedish Academy thinks are producing the best literary works in the world. Once they have 20 names, well, then they keep working until they have 5 final candidates, and that's usually in May, sometime before summer, because then they spend the rest of the summer reading. They have to read everything that these Nobel candidates have written, and it's the one who will eventually receive the prize has probably been on this list a few years, so it's a long process. You have to be nominated several years in order to get the prize. So they really know everything that they've written, and they know enough that it's important work. So it's hard work reading. Then in September, they meet again, and then they start deciding who should get the prize. So there are some heated discussions, and then in October, they announce the new Nobel laureates. And in December, the laureates come to Stockholm to get the gold medal. But the interesting thing is, September, that's when they start making the decision for the laureate. Well, that's also the year when they start sending out nominations for next year. So it actually it's a cycle that never ends. It just keeps going. So it's hard work. This is the room in the building where they have their meetings. You can see the Academy members behind this window. And when you look at the Nobel Prize for Literature, it's important to look a little bit about, I will talk more about the writers in a minute, but I also want to focus a little bit on the people, the work that they do when they select laureates, because that's really important to understand how the prize works and why the people who get the prize get the prize. This is a very old academy. It was founded by the Swedish king in 1786, so more than 200 years ago. And it was started as an academy that would work with the Swedish language. One of the academy's most important jobs is to produce a Swedish dictionary. So this means that there are a lot of people in a society who work with language. It's not only writers, it's always also bishops and lawyers and politicians and diplomats. So when the academy got the question, would you like to give out the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1900 or so, 120 years ago, they were at first quite reluctant because they were not at that point expert in literature, they were experts in the Swedish language. And this would be an international modern literature prize. So a lot of members wanted to say no. But other members of the Academy say, well, couldn't this prize make the Swedish Academy famous and prestigious all over the world? Up until 1901, when the first prize was awarded, more or less no one outside of Sweden had heard of the Nobel Prize, heard of the Swedish Academy. Now, 100 years later, is the Swedish, well, I'm giving a talk about the Swedish Academy in Dubai. That would not have happened without the Nobel Prize, I can guarantee you. So they decided that, sure, we'll give out the prize. And this was actually led to a lot of protests in Sweden. Some of the more modern writers in Swedish society were skeptical about this. They thought that the Swedish Academy would embarrass Swedish literary society in the world because they would probably pick the wrong winners. And in 1901, when lots of famous writers like Leo Tolstoy and Henrik Ibsen were nominated for the prize, they gave the prize to a French poet called Sully Prudhomme, who no one really had heard of. And as one Swedish newspaper wrote about it, no one has heard about him, and those who have heard about him don't like him. So maybe not the best choice for the first Nobel Prize. But they made better choices after that. So these are some of the people who have won the prize. And when you look back, when you see how have the... When you look back at and thinking about how to evaluate, if that's what you can do, the work of the Swedish Academy, how have they done this job of giving out the Nobel Prize for about 120 years? There are two risks that we should avoid. The first risk is to be too positive, too laudatory about this prize. The list of Nobel laureates is not an accurate list of the most influential writers of the 20th century and beyond. Some of the most influential writers are on that list, but not all. The other risk is being too critical, only focusing on the omissions and mistakes, because any assessment of the prize need to take into consideration how hard it is for the committee to actually do this job. And it's also the case that the criteria for choosing the literature prize is not very clear in the will of Alfred Nobel. He doesn't say what kind of literature he wanted the Academy to select. So they had to interpret his will in different ways. And there's one very important thing that is said in Alfred Nobel's will. It says that the people who receive the prize should have conferred the greatest benefit to mankind. In science, it's quite clear what this means. It means that science is good for mankind. Science brings us prosperity and health and material wealth and so on. But what does the benefit of mankind mean in the context of literature? And when we look at the history of the prize, we'll see that this phrase is interpreted and reinterpreted over and over again. But there are a few basic criteria that you need to fulfill in order to get the Nobel Prize. The first one is the most easy one. You have to be alive. And so that's, well, you can't be dead to get the Nobel Prize. And the second criteria is also that you don't, well, you have to have written something, but you don't have to have written a novel or poetry. You can also have written philosophy, history, or, as it turns out, music lyrics, because the rules of the Nobel Prize says that any kind of texts that have a literary value can be awarded the Nobel Prize. And it's up to the Swedish Academy to decide what the literary value is. And the prize is also, it's not given to a specific book. The exhibition we have downstairs is, of course, about specific works, but the prize is not given for that specific book. It's given for the whole body of work. And this is different from the other prizes, by the way. The science prizes are usually given for, or always given to a certain invention or discovery, which means that you can get that prize actually more than one time if you make another invention. But in literature, it's a lifetime achievement, more or less. And actually, Nobel also wrote another thing in his will. He wrote that the prize should be given to someone that had produced works in an idealistic direction. Now, we don't know exactly what he meant by that, but as one member of the committee has said, that this places some responsibility on the committee. They can't give, as the member said, writings however brilliant, that advocate, say, murder will not comply with the will. So there are some rules. But apart from sort of that you can sort of advocate genocide, there are no really boundaries for the prize. So instead, the committee have taken on some themes of their own, some ideas what they think that the prize should be about, and those are the ones that I would like to talk about. This is a picture from the first 3 or 4 decades of the Nobel Prize. A time when the committee sort of struggled with what the prize should be. And these are all different ways of selecting laureates. This is Sully Prudhomme, the first laureate of the Nobel Prize, who was a very unpopular choice, basically everyone thought. But he did write in a style that the members of the Academy of that time thought was idealistic and therefore in compliance with the will of Alfred Nobel. So you have to remember the interpretations. Maybe according to that it was okay, but most people didn't think so. And for a couple of years, they tried to give these kinds of idealistic poets the prize. But then in the 1920s, they modernized somehow. They broadened the scope. They took in a novelist like Thomas Mann. However, he got the prize in 1929, a year when he had produced maybe his most important work, called The Magic Mountain. But he got the prize specifically for an older work called Buddenbrooks from 1900. So the prize was not at all up to date with the new trends in modernist literature. Writers like Virginia Woolf or Marcel Proust and so on never stood a chance. Then the last writer here is Sinclair Lewis in the 1930s, and he represents a very peculiar way of looking at the literature prize. In the 1930s, the Nobel committees thought that, well, we have this for the benefit of mankind. So for the benefit of mankind, that should mean books that everyone can read and understand, so as broad as possible. And Sinclair Lewis was an American writer who wrote satirical and comical books. He's probably not as remembered as other persons for his literary value as other members of his generation. He was very happy to get the Nobel Prize. He didn't expect it, and he sent the chairman of the Nobel Committee a car as a gift after getting the prize, which was a very expensive gift in 1930. But the change in the Nobel Prize really came, well, during the Second World War, in a sense. There was sort of a break. During the Second World War, 1939 to 45, there were no awards given out. And during that time, the Nobel Committee could sort of think about the prize, take stock. And new members had come into the Academy who were not as, who were more modern. And they have also, as I said in the beginning, there were lots of people who weren't writers and literary scholars in the Academy. By the 1940s, they had increased in numbers who actually knew literature. So now they started a campaign of giving the pioneers of modern literature the prize. Many people think it was a bit too late, but then nevertheless, these people got the prize. So you have T.S. Eliot, Hermann Hesse, and this trend, of course, continued, and you have Naguib Mahfouz as also a modernizer and a pioneer, in a sense. He got the prize in 1988, of course. And this is, of course, one of the trends that go on still today. This was not just in the 40s, but they still today, they give the prize to people who are pioneers in their fields. We also see prizes to people like Samuel Beckett and so on. And then in the 1970s, the members of the Academy started realizing that at this point, the Nobel Prize had become very famous. So they thought, how can we use this fame, this high status, for the benefit of mankind? Well, not by picking writers that everyone already knows, that everyone can read, but let's pick writers that are not very famous. Let's pick writers who most people don't know, and then we'll give them the prize, and then people who know about them. These are a few examples in that genre. Isaac Bashevis Singer, who got the prize, and he wrote in Yiddish, a very small language, in 1978. Wisława Szymborska, a Polish poet, who got the prize in 96. And I forgot the last one. Is this Jaroslav Seifert? Seifert, yeah. I have a colleague who's a literary expert who's nodding. Thanks. Yeah, so this also goes on today to try to pick. So basically the idea here is it's called the pragmatic view of the prize. If you have two writers on that short list who you think are equally deserving of equally high literary value, you should pick the one who's less known, because that will increase, it will do the most benefit in the sense that it will find more readers. If you have a writer who everyone knows, why give them the prize? And both these ideas of giving the prize to pioneers and to these unknown masters increased, again, the literary value of the prize. And the prize, by this point, by the 80s, were starting to get more and more of a high reputation among writers and literary scholars. But there was still one big problem. There are still more than one problem, but this is one thing. And in the 1980s, it was quite clear that the prize was very Eurocentric. Up until the 1980s, only 2 writers who did not come from Europe or America had received the prize. 4 writers, sorry. And most of them wrote in European languages. And the problem with this is that this was, well, there were lots of problems, but the prizes, it says in the will of Alfred Nobel that the prizes, it's explicit, that prizes should be given to people regardless of nationality. So it's supposed to be an international prize. And in the 1901, for Europeans, international meant the rest of Europe. But by the 1980s, it was sort of embarrassingly clear that there was a bigger world outside of Europe if we wanted to be truly international. So they started changing this somehow, and they started broadening this. And this was, of course, not about, in any sense, about sort of, trying to lower standards to get more people in. Instead, it was, and they recognize this very clearly, this is about the committee trying to raise their standards to recognize more literature in more parts of the world. And these are some of examples of people who got the prize in this sort of beginning. They have Wole Soyinka, the first African Nobel laureate in 1986. Ken Saburo, a Japanese writer in 1994, not the first Japanese writer, but one of few. And then Gabriel Garcia Marquez in 1982, who you also find an exhibition about downstairs. Naguib Mahfouz is, of course, an example here as well. And of course, these themes can also coincide, the literature of the world and unknown masters and pioneers. And Gabriel Garcia Marquez is a good example of that. He was, of course, not only a Colombian writer, and he was also a pioneer of magical realism, and maybe an unknown master outside of the Latin American world. And the prize gave him more fame and a bigger, larger audience. The trend that we seem to start in the 2000s or so, after the new millennium, that we still see something of today, is something that has been called witness literature. Here we see Imre Kertész, who wrote about the Holocaust, Herta Müller, who wrote about the dictatorship in Romania, and Gao Xingyang, who wrote about living in China, not least during the Cultural Revolution, in one of his famous books. There are other writers as well. For example, Svetlana Alexievich, who there's an exhibition about downstairs, writing about the Soviet Union. Basically a category of writers that have described living under oppression in harsh regimes, both historically and in the present. And these different shifts in how the prize is awarded, you have to remember, is because there are new members of the Academy. The Academy changes members slowly, but they do change members. And when new people come in and they think that this is what the prize should look like today. But preparing for a lecture like this is actually quite hard, because even though we can see these themes in the prize, it's also clear that the prize is not every laureate falls into one of these nice categories. Not least since, as I mentioned in the beginning, the prize can be given to lots of different genres. It can be any text that has a literary value. So we see prizes to, this is an epic novelist like Maria Vargas Llosa, poetry for Thomas Tranström in the middle, and then a playwright like Harold Pinter. And this mix of genres is also probably expanding these last few years. For example, in 1997, there was an outcry. And as long as there's a new genre, there's always controversy. And when Dario Fo received the prize in 1997, people were very skeptical. They said he's not a writer because he's more of he is a playwright, but he's also a performance artist and almost a stand-up comedian. And in the middle, again, Svetlana Alexievich, who's a journalist. So now people realize that you can get a Nobel Prize for being a journalist. And then a few years ago, Bob Dylan received the prize. Now you can get the prize for writing music lyrics. So it's a prize that tried to broaden its scope, both in terms of nationality of the people who get the prize, but also in terms of genre and in terms of genre. And then there are, of course, some controversies. I think I mentioned a couple of them. But it's important to note also that the Nobel Prize is almost always controversial. This has to do with the fact that it's a prize for literature. The prizes in science are not that criticized, because usually when there's a new prize in physics, the public and the press are occupied with trying to understand what this prize is all about. But when there's a new prize in literature, everyone is concerned with talking about whether or not this was a good prize or not. And most people who read books have a favorite writer. More people have a favorite writer. Most people do not have a favorite physicist or chemist. So in that sense, every literature prize is controversial and debated. But then, of course, some prizes are more controversial than others. This is Jean-Paul Sartre, who received the Nobel Prize in 1964. He was the first person to voluntarily say no to the Nobel Prize. And he did this in quite an interesting way, because he had heard rumors that he was nominated for the prize. I said in the beginning that everything is very secret, but he had still heard that maybe someone he knew had sent in the nomination for him. So he wrote a letter to the Nobel Foundation saying that if you're planning to giving me the prize, I will say no. He was quite clear that he didn't mean this as a criticism of the Nobel Prize. Rather, he said no to all prizes. He didn't want to be sort of tied to or connected to a single institution. But the Academy, who vote on the prize, apart from two members of the Academy, the chairman and the secretary of the committee, they did not know that Sartre planned to say no. So they voted on the prize, and voted on the prize and gave Sartre the prize. Only afterwards did they hear that he actually planned to decline it. And when he eventually got the prize and he heard this, then he was quite angry, because he had tried to say no and they gave the prize to him anyway. And then he wrote a long article in the French press criticizing the prize very much. He said that he could never accept this prize. It's too political and it's too, basically too political, and it's used as a political tool by this Swedish Academy. We'll get back to that, but there's a quite common criticism of the prize, that it's political. The other prize that's controversial is the prize to these two, Eyvind Jonsson and Harry Martinsson, two Swedish writers. Both very well-regarded writers in Sweden and at this time. This was in 1974. They were highly regarded in Sweden, and some little bit famous outside of Sweden. But the problem is that famous Swedish writers tend to end up in the Swedish Academy of Literature. this means that they were members of the academy that gave them the prize. And this was really controversial, of course. If you're a member of the academy, you should not get the prize yourself. That was the idea in the Swedish press. This was a very highly criticized and controversial prize. Even Jonsson stopped writing afterwards, but that's probably because he was quite old and he actually died shortly afterwards. But Harry Martinsson became depressed and eventually committed suicide over this, to a large extent over the criticism of having given himself the Nobel Prize. So it's a very sad and extreme case, but it seems to confirm another idea of the Nobel Prize that many people talk about. The idea that getting the Nobel Prize can be a kiss of death. If you're a writer and then you get the Nobel Prize, there's too much pressure and you stop writing. Many people believe this to be true, but so one of the researchers at the Nobel Prize Museum a few years ago wanted to look at this. So they looked statistically at this and they could see that it's not true. There are some writers that stop writing after receiving the prize, but that's usually because they're quite old, so they die. But people who are still active when they get the prize keep being active. And it's also the case that when you get the prize, the same researchers could show that after the prize you are much more translated, so you reach a much wider audience. So actually this is it's not a kiss of death, it might be good for your career. Although you will get more attention for about a year or so, but then that will ebb out. So yeah, I mentioned to end this, I would like to address some of the criticisms to the prize because it's a bit interesting. When you talk about, I mentioned Sartre, who said that the prize is too political. That is a very common view of the Nobel Prize for Literature, that this is a political prize. And certainly the Nobel committees have not shied away from writers who have political messages. But political concerns is never a part of the considerations for the laureates. That's what the Nobel Prize, the Swedish Academy claim, and it's supported by the archival evidence. And a case in point is that, for example, in 2006, Harold Pinter, a very left-leaning playwright, got the prize, a very controversial political figure. And the Swedish Academy received a lot of criticism from the right saying, oh, you are a leftist socialist, you gave the prize to Pinter. 4 years later, Mario Vargas Llosa got the prize, who is a more right-wing, is actually a right-wing politician, conservative liberal politician. And the Swedish Academy got criticism from the left, saying that, oh, you are old and conservative and you give this right-wing writer the prize. So yes, they give the prize to political writers, but that's not because they are political. The truth is that the committee does everything it can to avoid being political. And another criticism that is raised often is the international scope of the prize. How can a small Swedish committee possibly award literature from all over the world? And actually the Nobel Committee, the Swedish Academy, actually consists of scholars who know a lot of languages. And they have very qualified help in getting translations and, again, getting the nomination system. But it's quite obvious that this criticism is nevertheless valid. There are many more European nations and languages among the laureates than there probably should be. And large languages like Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, Hindi, and so on are not represented. And since the 1980s, the situation has been improving, but many people think it's not improving fast enough. And what I would like to end with saying is that we have to be aware of why this is a problem. It's a problem because maybe the most deserving writers are not getting the prize. Maybe the world is not, maybe we're not giving the prize to people maybe we're missing out on lots of literary works. What can be a problem is when we start looking at the Nobel Prize as a competition, that every time someone gets the Nobel Prize, it's a sort of 1 point for that country. Because the Nobel Prize is not a competition. It's not a contest between the greatest literary writers in the world. It's not the literary Olympics. Instead, I think we should look at the Nobel Prize as an honor that the Swedish Academy can give to some of the writers in the world that they judge to be of very high literary value. They can't give it to all the writers of the high literary value. They have to limit themselves to once a year. So rather than seeing the Nobel Literature Prize as the World Cup or Olympics for literature, maybe we should see the Nobel Prize as the world's most prestigious book club, where readers every year get introduced to new great works of literature. And it is in that spirit that we have built the exhibition that we are here opening today. In the exhibition, we look at some of the works that have received the Nobel Prize, and we invite you, all visitors, to explore these new literary worlds. And since we also believe that reading can open up new worlds and perspectives, I think this is really a good interpretation of what Nobel meant for the benefit of mankind. And that's the end of the talk. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, please come up to me afterwards. I'll be everyone. Thank you.